Can I have your attention? My name is Steve Clemons. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. Any folks in the back, please come up and take a seat. We're going to have a fun afternoon. We've got one of, I think, the most informed and thoughtful commentators on the Middle East here with us today. I've been fortunate to have had mostly a virtual relationship with Juan Cole through blogging and email, but we've become buddies of a sort whenever I find out that he's coming through Washington very frequently to help our government have better sensors and benchmarks on what's going on over there. And I think this was probably not always the case. Our government was not always interested in listening to the people who knew a lot what was going on, but the tide seems to be turning. I also want to say welcome to our C-SPAN audience that's with us today. My good friend Bill Breer just came in. Bill, just walk right in and come up and take the front seat. You get the leg room. Let me tell you a few things about Juan Cole. Juan, I know best through his blog Informed Comment, and all of you can go to juancole.com and read what I think is one of the premier blogs on religion, history, culture of the Middle East. It is an absolutely must-read for anyone who's regularly commenting. I was just on the blog a few moments ago and was reading just a clip about an Iranian temporary move into the Kurdish region, chasing some terrorists there. Juan gathers material and information from the Arab press and shares it with all of us, and it's material that we just don't get here in either the English language press here in the United States or Britain or others, and I think that it plays just a phenomenal role in helping us remain informed. He's also a professor of Middle Eastern and South Asian history at the University of Michigan. He's the president of the Global Americana Institute. He's a regular column in Salon.com, and we're here today to discuss his new book, Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East, which I've already begun, and it's mesmerizing. I started 11 years ago, an institute with Chalmers Johnson called the Japan Policy Research Institute, and Chal and I have both kind of gone global since. But I liked Chal's comments about the book. And what Chal has said is, we are told at the time of their invasion of Iraq, the top leaders of the United States did not know anything about the division within Islam between Sunni and Shia, or for that matter, the history of Iraq, Iran, Egypt, or the other key countries of the Middle East. Typical Chalmers. If any American is interested in catching up, the place to begin is with Juan Cole's Napoleon's Egypt, The Invention of the Middle East, a masterful and beautifully written account of Western imperialism's first assault on the Islamic world. I couldn't agree more with Chalmers, and as I said at the beginning, one of the things that does give me some hope now and then is that Juan does come through Washington, is talking to people of significance in our intelligence and foreign policy bureaucracies, and is trying to educate them on what is going on. Whether they're listening and implementing anything he is saying is an entire different subject, perhaps for another day. But without further ado, please help me welcome Juan Cole.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for that warm introduction. My gratitude to the New America Foundation for kindly sponsoring this event. And what I want to do today is to talk a little bit about these what I call bookends of Western intervention in the Middle East. Bonaparte in Egypt, an episode which has slipped, I think, largely from public memory, except in some circles in France and some circles in Egypt. But a very important benchmark of sorts in Western relations with the region. And then the current American misadventure in Iraq. As I researched and wrote this book in the 1990s primarily, and its publication was much delayed because I got caught up in the events of 9/11 and the Iraq War. But as I watched things unfold in the early zeros, I was often amazed, and chills went down my spine at how eerily resonant many of the Egyptian events were with what had later happened in Iraq. Let's talk first of all about motives. And one of the things you'll find if you read much about the French in Egypt in 1798 through 1801 is that the historians usually admit puzzlement. Why did Bonaparte do this? You can understand why he invaded Italy. You could understand even, maybe it wasn't wise, but you could understand why he invaded Spain or he invaded Russia. But why did he invade Egypt? So it's a standard question, and many historians will begin their books on this episode and say, well, we don't really know why, and then go on and just tell us what happened. But I was struck that we also have no idea really why the Bush administration invaded Iraq. We supposedly live in a transparent democracy. Our leaders are supposed to inform us as to why they make important policy, and yet I couldn't tell you exactly what the motives were. Certainly they didn't seem to know themselves because they kept changing their story about it. You know, it's almost like a criminal investigation when you have the perpetrator under the lights and you say, why did you do such and such? And he says one thing one day and says another thing the next. Any policeman will tell you that that's the perp, the one who keeps changing his story. So why did they do this? We don't know. Now, I have some theories about why Bonaparte went into Egypt, let me see if I can also come up with some ideas about the possible parallels to the present. But one reason for going into Egypt was that Bonaparte had taken Italy. Italy at that time, the northern parts at least, were under the Austrian Empire. And the Austrian Empire and the Prussian Empire had been very upset about the French Revolution. We forget now how controversial it was, but after all, the Austrian monarchy was related to Marie Antoinette, and they rather minded the way she was treated. And so they wanted to invade France and get rid of this heretical movement towards not having monarchs. So the French Republic was forced to riposte and to fight back, and then I think got a little bit of a taste for conquest and went on to conquer much of Europe under Napoleon later on. But the first big event was the invasion of Italy in 1796, and Bonaparte was chosen to lead that effort, and he performed brilliantly. He innovated in the use of artillery tactics. He innovated in the use of infantry in conjunction with artillery, and he broke the Austrian lines at a number of important points, and he conquered much of Italy. And it turns out that Italy happens to be a window on the east. The Venetians and the Italians had long had very strong trade relations with Alexandria in Egypt. They had very strong trade relations with Istanbul. They had a long history of intervention in places like Albania. So once Bonaparte was more or less the viceroy of Italy, his Italian interests drew him into the Levant. He began to see you can't have a prosperous Italy in this period, excuse me, unless you also develop these trade relations with the East. So that's one. Then, in addition to which, Bonaparte developed a theory that the Ottoman Empire was decaying, was falling apart, and he was very much afraid that it would decay quickly. And if the Ottoman Empire, which was one of the largest empires in the world at that time, had stretched from what is now the Balkans, Turkey, into Iraq, Syria, Egypt, North Africa. If this empire fell apart, Bonaparte thought, well, who's going to pick up the pieces? And he concluded it would be the British and the Russians. And if the British and the Russians pick up the pieces of the Ottoman Empire, France, Republican France, ends up being this tiny little place off in West Europe without all those resources that would come from dominating the Eastern Mediterranean. So in order to forestall a British and a Russian advance into the declining Ottoman Empire, he would go ahead and take Egypt right now. And the only thing wrong with this theory was that it was 115 years ahead of its time. He was absolutely right about everything that he said in this regard, but he just was off with regard to the timing. In fact, during World War I, what he expected to happen did happen. But he wanted to forestall what he saw as Russian and British inroads into Egypt. And this comes to another reason to invade Egypt, which was the French rivalry with Britain. Britain also minded the French Revolution, despite having a parliament of its own, saw it as a hotbed of radicalism and terrorism, and wanted to strangle the French Republic in its cradle. And the British, at one point, occupied the French port of Toulon. They tried to interfere with French-controlled ports on the continent. They tried to blockade some of them for a while. They didn't succeed very well in all of these things, but they did have naval dominance. And Bonaparte was in contact with a French politician named Talleyrand, and Talleyrand had developed a theory that the British might actually end up defeating the French. And why? Because the British still had colonies. The French at this time didn't have colonies, for the most part. They had Martinique, a few nice Caribbean possessions, but they lost Haiti, and there was the revolt of Toussaint Louverture later on, but that kind of event was already going on in the 1790s. And earlier in what we call in America the French and Indian War, that really was a world war between the French and British empires, and our little piece of it was only one piece. And it was also fought, by the way, in India. The French had Madras, they had South India, and they were defeated there. And Talleyrand, despite being a supporter of the revolution, a leftist, if you will, of his day, began thinking that, well, the old French monarchy had it right, that these colonies brought all kinds of benefits. And the British now were getting those benefits. They were getting the benefit of Bengal sugar, and they had North America. The French had lost Quebec, and so forth. And what the French really needed was colonies back. Now, Talleyrand thought that the old way of doing colonies had been wrong, that they were basically slave colonies, slave plantations. And he said, well, that's over with, because the French Convention had abolished slavery. Not very effectively, but they had passed the resolution. And he thought, well, let's not do slave plantations. Let's do republican colonies. Conquer places, install a republican government, make it subordinate to France, benefit from the imports of their raw materials and so forth. And that will help to give us the kind of advantage that the British have with their overseas empire. And I called this in my book an 18th century form of neoconservatism, because he is hearkening back to conservative themes of colonialism that had been very much supported by the monarchy in the 1600s and which had been abandoned in the course of the Enlightenment. Most of the Enlightenment thinkers were deeply critical not only of slavery but also of colonialism, and one of the reasons for the abolition of slavery by the convention in the 1790s was precisely to forestall any further colonialism. So Bonaparte came under Talleyrand's intellectual influence in this regard. So all these things came together: the Italian trade interests, the fear of Russian and British penetration of the Middle East, the desire to forestall that and to take it for France instead, the neoconservative theory of neocolonialism, in a French context. All of these came into it. And of course, there were models in the continent for this kind of thing, because when the French take Holland, they install the French Republic of Holland, Batavia, and they have a mirror of the French government there. And it's nevertheless subordinate to France. So the French military has a lot to say about what goes on, but it's considered a republic and has French-style republican laws and so forth. So they were going to do the same thing in Egypt. Likewise, I think it's very clear that part of what Iraq has been about for the Bush administration is neocolonialism. The British Orientalist Bernard Lewis said words to the effect that colonialism in the Middle East done by Britain and France didn't take. It went bad. You know, and I suppose to be fair, his comparison would be, say, to India, where the Indians, after independence in '47, managed to have regular elections for the most part, and there was quite an elitist form of democracy, but nevertheless a kind of democracy. There were multi-party systems, and there was more or less freedom of the press and so forth. That the British colonial experiment in India took. And so the Indians inherited those Anglo-Saxon institutions to some extent. As they moved into modernity, they reworked them for their own purposes, but Indian politics looks very familiar to Western eyes. But in the Middle East, after the British and French empires collapsed there, especially after World War II, what you get is military dictatorships. You get the Ba'ath Party, you get proto-Stalinist parties, you get dictatorships, you get regimes that are perfectly willing to gas their own people, and so forth. So what Lewis is saying is that this thing went very bad. Somehow, the institutions of Republican France and of parliamentary Britain didn't really take in the aftermath, and so it has to be done over again. And the Americans will do it, and this time they'll get it right, and they'll bequeath to Iraq a democratic polity, which then will become a model for the rest of the region. So I hear Lewis speaking, I hear Talleyrand in the back of my head. It's a very similar scheme. You conquer the place, you rule it militarily, you hold local elections and put local leaders in, you make a Western-style constitution and so forth. I'm here to tell you it didn't work then, it's not going to work now. And the idea that Lewis had of a neocolonialism to repeat the colonial experiment and get it right this time, the problem with it is that it's so abstract. I mean, there are real people living in Iraq with real aspirations of their own, with their own histories and ideas. You can't just walk in and imagine that they're a blank slate on which things can be formed. I mean, Lewis seems to think about the Middle Easterners that they're Play-Doh. You know, we made a little Play-Doh figure. It was kind of malformed, so we'll just crush it up and then we'll redo it and make it nice this time. Well, they're not Play-Doh. They talk back. And the thing that's so similar between Bonaparte's Egypt and Bush's Iraq is that they both occur at times when Western technological and societal organization and technology is just not that much more advanced than what's available to local people. I think there is, in the 19th century, a moment, it lasted maybe 150 years, in which the Europeans had such better technology, better organization, that they really could dominate a place like Algeria. You had to be willing to kill a lot of people and be very brutal and crush people for decades at a time, but it could be done if you really wanted to do it. And people were, in India under the British, were living in small villages. They were mostly illiterate. They weren't very connected with one another. They didn't have the means of fighting back very effectively. And so it could be done. in the 19th and early 20th century. Again, the Americans did it in the Philippines at an estimated cost of 400,000 Filipino lives, by the way. And it tells you something about the callousness and brutality of the American power elite, that they actually instanced the Philippines as a success story of American colonialism on the eve of going into Iraq. And one said that if we have to do in Iraq what we did in the Philippines, i.e. kill 400,000 people, then we should. So the brutality of this is important to note. But that period, sort of between Napoleon's Egypt and or Bonaparte's Egypt and Bush's Iraq, was exceptional, and it has passed. Because now people in the third world, mostly literate, mostly urbanized, believe it or not, they're no longer living in small villages. They've joined political parties. The social scientists call this social mobilization. And they point out that social mobilization is an excellent platform for political mobilization. And so basically they don't have to put up with being ruled by a distant metropole anymore, and they don't. There are local middle-class groups, wealthy groups that have their own local interests, don't want to be subordinated to policy coming from abroad, and who will help to fund these things. And then, of course, there's military technology. In an age that C4 can be bought on the open market in large amounts, in which roadside bombs of sophistication can be constructed, it's very difficult to fight a guerrilla war under those circumstances. So I think Bonaparte's Egypt and Bush's Iraq have this similarity, one at a time before Western superiority was assured, another at a time after it had passed. And this is tragic for the Americans because at least Bonaparte had been right. I mean, his timing, as I said, was a century off, but he was right about what was likely to happen in the future. And his failure in Egypt did not forestall a relative long-term French success in colonizing Algeria, Tunisia, and elsewhere in Indochina. But Bush tried to do this at a time when the age of colonialism had passed, and had passed for very strong sociological reasons. And this is one of the things that I think that if I could retrain Washington bureaucrats in anything, it would just be to expose them to Karl Deutsch and the modern tradition and Chuck Tilley and the modern tradition of the sociological study of mobilization of populations, because this is what they seem not to understand, that populations can mobilize nowadays in very effective ways and can't just be crushed easily. Why did they go into Iraq? Well, there's a passage in General Wesley Clark's new book in which he recounts a conversation with Paul Wolfowitz, who later was Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time of the Iraq War. And this is a conversation from the early 90s after the Soviet Union had fallen. And Wolfowitz is alleged to have told Clark, he said, "We've got now a window. The Soviet Union has fallen. There is no peer to the United States. It's the sole superpower." Words to this effect. But that's not going to last forever. China will come up, for instance, and will be blocked again, because there were lots of things that Washington would have liked to do during the Cold War that it couldn't do because it knew that the Soviets would riposte. And now the Soviets were gone, the Russians weren't interested, and the Americans had a free hand. But Wolfowitz, according to this account, thought the free hand was not going to last that long. There was a temporary window until China came up and the U.S. would be stymied again in various ways. And Wolfowitz thought it's important to get rid of what he called these old Stalinist-style regimes like Iraq during this window. That's a little bit of an analogy to Talleyrand and Bonaparte's fear of being checked in the long term by the British Navy. It's this idea that there's a powerful rival looming on the horizon who eventually might interfere with your freedom of movement, if that interpretation is correct. Both of these invasions deployed a rhetoric of liberation. It was really quite remarkable the degree to which the rhetoric sounds alike. Bonaparte talked about the Mamluk government, the vassal slave soldiers, oppressing the Egyptian population. Bush talked about the Ba'ath regime in Iraq oppressing the Iraqi population. And so both Bonaparte and Bush pose as liberators. And the rhetorical device is, well, these governments are not legitimate, they're not representative, they are tyrannical, and therefore I may substitute myself for them and implement a Western-style republic, hold elections, and so forth. And both of them appointed a so-called elected government. The Alawi government in Iraq was an appointed government, but Alawi was called a prime minister, sort of looked like a parliamentary government. And Bonaparte appointed a council of Sunni clerics to run Egypt. And here's another irony that's true in both cases, that these are Enlightenment republics, the United States and France, with strong secular tendencies, however blunted they may be at the present, and nevertheless, in both Egypt and Iraq, France and the United States more or less imposed Islamic republics. I mean, the Islamic Republic was invented by Bonaparte and furthered by Bush. Bonaparte appointed the clerics of Al-Azhar Seminary to run Egypt, and Bush, I think willy-nilly, was pushed into having these elections in January 2005, the winners of which were the Shiite fundamentalist parties. The Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq was, I think, the primary winner of those elections, led by the cleric Abdulaziz al-Hakim. And then as soon as they could fashion an Iraqi constitution, they said that no law may be passed by parliament that contradicts Islamic law. They wanted to put in a special place for the Shiite clerics of Najaf and so forth. And why is this? Because these Enlightenment republics, France and the United States, lack legitimacy when they go into the Middle East. It's a colonial venture. Everybody knows they don't really belong there. So how would you get legitimacy? Is by garbing yourself in the legitimacy of Islam, which local leaders in the Middle East have long done. To conclude, these enterprises have been brutal. The Lancet study came out last fall, which I think is quite tight, suggested something on the order of 600,000 excess deaths from violence had occurred in Iraq since spring of 2003, above what you would have expected. And these are not all from war. I mean, criminal violence, tribal feuding, apparently about a quarter or so of those deaths owing directly to U.S. military action. Likewise in Egypt, Bonaparte had lots of people killed and beheaded, villages burned. There was a very brutal aspect to the occupation, and I think it's very interesting if you see these French accounts about the French cutting off the heads of 900 Egyptians and dumping them in the square in Cairo as an object lesson to scare everybody. And I have to say, 900 heads would scare a person. That we now associate beheadings with Islamic terrorism. But Bonaparte and the French Republic, of course, were the great beheaders initially. It was a very modern technique. So both of these experiments, I think, have run into this problem of local people being mobilized. There's a great attrition, and both of them should be object lessons against this kind of head-on intervention in the region. Thank you very much.
Let me grab this microphone here. Thank you, Juan. I don't know if you can hear me here. I hope you can. I can barely hear myself, the cold I have. First of all, thank you for answering the question I posed on my blog, The Washington Note, which was how to tie this into Iraq, which you've done beautifully. Let me start with two questions, and then I'll open up the floor. The first is one on the history side, which I found interesting. I've just finished the book Augustus by Anthony Everett, who also wrote Cicero. If anyone wants to read a really great book, that's one to go through. And Everett talks about Rome in Egypt. And Rome, of course, had conquered Egypt. And before that, you reminded me of Cleopatra's descending from one of the generals of
Alexander
the Great, right, the Ptolemies. So one raises the question of why did it work then and not later? But the bigger question, Nir Rosen is here. Nir's in the back. And Nir has constant rounds of fame. His most recent statement was on Democracy Now! On Amy Goodman's show the other day that there is no longer an Iraq. And it begs the question of the difference with Egypt. Egypt is an ancient state. Iraq is an ancient place, but not an ancient state. And I'm interested in whether you could comment on Nir's comments at all, and whether or not there's some fundamental difference in some places in the Middle East when you're dealing with an Egypt as opposed to an Iraq, which many people thought was a patched-together assembly that didn't have the same kind of state structure. And we're now trying to preserve something that's perhaps unpreservable anyway. So I'd be interested in those two.
Well, of course, with regard to Rome and the Byzantine Empire, they ruled Egypt for several hundred years. And again, I mean, I think there are these moments in history when an empire has sufficient technological and organizational superiority to impose itself more broadly. That was true of the Romans and Byzantines in Egypt, later on of the Muslims who invaded from Arabia in the 7th century. But what I'm suggesting is that in 21st century conditions, direct empire becomes really, really difficult. I don't say impossible, but really, really difficult. You know, a foreign power can conquer and remain forcefully in a country with an army of occupation only if it's willing really to commit a kind of genocide, because people are mobilized and they'll fight against it. And even with regard to the Romans in Egypt, towards the end, of course, it was the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, that ruled Egypt. There's some evidence that the Egyptians really didn't fight to retain that government when the Arab Muslims came in, because the Byzantines had tried to impose Eastern Orthodoxy as the form of Christianity in Egypt, and the Egyptians were Coptic. They had their own. So even with regard to the Romans, towards the end, I think they were weakened by their social policies. With regard to Egypt and Iraq as nations or as states, of course, we historians think that the nation state is very modern. Everybody has their myths about Italy being ancient and so forth, but there was no Italy before Garibaldi, quite frankly. And we Americans are not under these illusions, since we all have to admit that we have a modern state. But most romantic nationalisms tried to locate the state in ancient times, and certainly the Egyptian nationalism does, and the Iraqi as well. The Iraqis, by the way, think that they were an ancient state because they locate themselves, the nationalists among them, with regard to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And indeed, there are some ways in which the Iraqis probably invented the state. They invented a lot of things, probably writing, some kinds of mathematics and astronomy, and the state. But what I would argue about the contemporary period is that the Nile is a relatively slow-flowing river and allows for a lot of riverine commerce and connectedness up and down from Aswan to Alexandria. And you can see it in the life ways of people and the connectedness of people. And that has been true all along. And so Egypt is much more homogeneous, whereas the Tigris and Euphrates are often quite violent rivers. And they are what give Mesopotamia or Iraq any kind of unity, but they are much more difficult to navigate in all seasons and so forth. And so you have much more ethnic diversity. So I would locate it a little bit in geography.
Terrific. Let me open the floor. Right here.
Yeah. Do you see a parallel between Napoleon's exit from Egypt and what will probably be our exit from Iraq?
Yeah. Well, no, that's a good question about Napoleon's exit and our exit. Napoleon, or Bonaparte, had several problems with staying in Egypt. One was that the British Navy sank much of his fleet. He took this modern, beautiful fleet that had 12 ships. Had 12 ships of the line and so forth, and Nelson had a similar number, and they fought, and in early August of 1798, and the French lost that naval battle, and so Bonaparte and his army ended up being marooned in Egypt. They were very depressed about it, and it wasn't clear how they would ever get back out. And Bonaparte then tried to get out through Syria, but he couldn't get his heavy artillery to Syria, so he couldn't reduce the old Crusader fort that the Ottoman governor was using. So he couldn't take Syria, so he was blocked there, and so he came back to Cairo. He declared he'd had a great victory in Syria. And Karl Rove had nothing on Bonaparte. So Bonaparte then slips out of Egypt and goes back to France in fall of 1799, having convinced the French newspapers that he had a series of glorious victories in the East and that he's France's savior. And he uses this as a platform to make a coup and come to power. So here's a screw-up who had an enormous fiasco and marooned tens of thousands of French military men, lost the fleet, and comes to power to save France from its incompetent government on the basis of these failures, because he had parlayed them into a reputation for glory and success. So it just goes to show you that in politics, being a failure and a screw-up is no guarantee that you won't win.
Yes, right here.
Paul Shem.
Just speak loudly, Paul.
What's that?
Just speak loudly.
Okay. Couple of comments. I think that you've made a very good parallel between the connections of incipient or mercantile conservatism with modern neoconservatism. The thing that I think is also true of both of them, that I'm not sure you would agree, is that I think part of it that it was believed that this was also an ideology that I think Napoleon and some of the neocons thought that they were actually bringing liberation. A couple of points on I think you left out one of the most important reasons for Napoleon going to Egypt, which is to say in glory, being the new Alexander, the speech that he gave at the pyramids, all of that, I think that was a major factor, and I'm not sure that that really played as much now. Finally, you mentioned Talleyrand as one who helped push him there. Talleyrand, who was the most devious politician in Europe, probably, if he urged Napoleon to go there, he had at least half a hope that Napoleon would die there and rid France of the problem. So I think that all of these, I think, connected to what was going on, but I think your analogies really work quite well as a framework.
So the question is, what was Bush really doing with Paul Brown?
Well, actually, Talleyrand proposed this neo-colonial scheme in a speech to the National Institute in summer of 1797, before he got much involved with Bonaparte, and he made it a platform to become foreign minister, I think. So I think Paul Barras and some of the other directors went for this plan because they thought Bonaparte is dangerous, and this is a way to get him out of Europe. He was kind of, after Italy, you know, he kind of became a power in his own right. He was intriguing to get up a war with Austria, and he was conducting his own foreign policy, and people were afraid he might try to make a coup. And of course, they were quite right to be afraid. So there were people who wanted to send him away. But I think that the major reasons for the expedition were more positive. And I think the other thing we shouldn't ignore about it was that the military in Italy faced being demobilized after its victory. So you had all of these officers who wanted another opportunity for loot, and of course they looted Italy, which is how you get the Louvre. So they wanted another opportunity for loot and for advancement and so forth. So the military was a lobbyer for this, and it was thought more likely that you would survive it than if you invaded England. Then the military contractors who had grown up and who became very close to the Parliament during the Italian campaign also thought that this was just a wonderful idea. And the Marseille merchant class, which had already ties with Alexandria, pushed for it. So I think there are social reasons to do it, and the social reasons also have resonances.
Right here.
Texaris, thank you for pointing out that Napoleon was way ahead of his time. My question is, you talked about this intriguing idea that Egypt is unified. It is a state, and Iraq is not. Could you, as a historian, talk about the dialogues, the historical dialogues in the various major groups inside Iraq today, and what their stories are and how they project their history into the future that we are dealing with this moment?
Well, one thing to say is that most pre-modern places were not very unified, including Egypt, which at the time Bonaparte went there, it was nominally a province of the Ottoman Empire, and it had a kind of military caste of slave soldiers called Mamluks ruling over it. But they were always fighting with each other, and there were tribes, and there were tribal feuds, and so forth. So there are ways in which Egypt didn't really hang together very well either. But if you controlled Cairo and the Nile, you really could control that place, more or less. You could get taxes out of it, and so forth. With regard to contemporary Iraq, of course, Iraq as a country didn't exist before World War I. Again, it was 3 or sometimes 4 provinces of the Ottoman Empire. It is true that Basra in the south and Mosul in the north were ruled by the Ottomans through Baghdad. So there was a kind of administrative unity to the place because everything went through Baghdad. But in contemporary times, you've had a very strong move towards what sociologists call ethnogenesis. Kurdish national identity has been reinforced by all of those same things I mentioned before: literacy, satellite TV, and the American no-fly zone that was put in after the Gulf War allowed the Kurds to elect their own parliament, to unify their administration, to teach Kurdish in schools. So I would say that this process has gone so far that Kurdistan in Iraq is more or less an independent country. And it's just not declared to be so because it would make everybody outside upset. The Iranians and the Turks and everybody would get upset about this. Baghdad would get upset about it. So they don't say it. But they're giving out visas.
It's a new Taiwan.
It's a new Taiwan, yeah. So they're giving out visas, they're making oil contracts, they're wheeling and dealing, they're acting like a state, they just don't call it that in name. And I don't expect Kurdistan to remain in the Iraqi framework in the long term. On the other hand, the Arab Iraqis, despite their Sunni Shiite differences, don't talk like that for the most part, and a lot of them are very devoted to having an Iraqi identity. And I expect them to be like the Lebanese in a way. You know, the Lebanese fought tooth and nail 75 to 89, and then they somehow made up, grudgingly. But I suspect that Kurdistan will hive off, but that the Arab Iraqis will find a way to stay together. It's not for sure, but that's my expectation.
Since I used Nir Rosen as a prop. Nir, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I certainly agree on Kurdistan. I think that probably the rest of Iraq will be subsumed by, perhaps a little bit by Jordan. I think Jordan will change politically and geographically as a result of this. Syria as well. I think Iraq will just sort of be a collection of warlords controlling small pieces of territory, with greater intervention on the part of Saudi Arabia supporting its proxies, and Iran supporting its proxies. But I think the difference between Lebanon and Iraq is the virulence of the Sunni Shia stuff, which is actually spreading to Lebanon, and now Lebanon is kind of becoming Iraqified in that sense. Sunni Takfiris looking to rally against Hezbollah and Shias. So I think, in fact, the whole Middle East might change its borders, and the war will spread.
Thank you. Interesting. You want to comment, Clark?
It's not an implausible scenario. I don't. It's not my number one, but it's certainly possible.
Interesting. Mike Hager.
Yes, Mike Hager, Education for Employment Foundation. Professor Cole, how do you see, or do you see comparisons between the two situations with respect to A, the management of the two occupations, and B, with respect to any fallout in terms of the metropole? I mean, I'm thinking of the civil right, the erosion of rights and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I make this point towards the end of my book that, ultimately, I mean, the Directory sent Bonaparte there to be a kind of emperor of the Egyptians and to get rid of him from France, and ended up with an emperor of France, and that emperors were not, a strong feature of Republican French institutional life, but were very common in the Middle East. And that I think probably historians have neglected the degree to which the Egyptian experience shaped Bonaparte's subsequent career and the fate of Europe. In a way, the French hoped to republicanize an Ottoman province, and ended up being Ottomanized with having an emperor and so forth themselves. And I think that's a danger of foreign military adventures, that it strengthens the defense contractors or the war contractors. It creates mercenaries. It strengthens the military. It strengthens the more authoritarian sectors of society, and it can blow back. Then all of a sudden, when you're at war, winning a war is an information process. It's a propaganda process as well as a military one, which means that free reporting and free comment are undesirable from a military point of view. And so this kind of long-term foreign military occupation is, I think, a threat to republics. And it ended the First Republic, and I think it has severely damaged the Iraq misadventure and the aftermath of September 11th, and the political responses to that in Washington have severely damaged the U.S. Republic with regard to basic civil rights.
Yes.
I think it's Peter Gray. I'm wondering, not knowing much about Napoleon's exit from Egypt, it seems that one thing that is happening now is that there is some pushback domestically in the U.S., and what can we learn from what happened in terms of Napoleon leaving? I mean, there's one parallel that he lost his ships. We seem to be losing our army. But if there's some way for you to expand on that.
Yeah. Well, because Bonaparte was still functioning in a bipolar world, basically it was France versus Britain, he was checked militarily in a way that I don't expect the United States to be checked in a unipolar world. The U.S. Doesn't have a major enemy that can inflict a major defeat like the Battle of the Nile was inflicted on the French. So I think that it's much more likely that the U.S. is just going to face this steady attrition. And the danger is that the attrition is being spun as not so bad or as even declining. I'm just shocked and amazed at how gullible many of our journalists and policymakers were. General Odierno came out on July 24th and said U.S. troop deaths were declining as a result of the surge in July. Well, first of all, July wasn't over with on the 24th, so how would he know whether the troop deaths were going to decline for that month? I mean, something big could have happened late in the month. And then when the month was over, it came out that about 80 of our troops had been killed. And July is not a time to fight in Iraq. Even the most fanatical insurgent would think twice about working on a roadside bomb in July. They go on vacation. So July is, if you look at the numbers, every July is 38 U.S. troops killed, 43 killed. So we had 80 killed this past July. General Odierno says that's a sign that the surge is working. And, you know, it just depends, when you hear these numbers, be very critical, because it depends on what they say the baseline is. If there are some fluctuations that are seasonal, that they are misrepresenting, and I'm afraid I think this was a deliberate misrepresentation, they must know. There are some things that are seasonal that they misrepresent as serial. And there is, as is what I said before, is that, you know, the truth is the first casualty of war. And I think the American public now has gotten wise to all of these things and isn't so easily swayed. But there was a 10% increase in the number of people who thought that the surge is working after Odierno gave that interview with CNN.
Wow. We'll do the best we can. Right here.
My name is Amy Zellman. My question is about historical narrative and the United States. To follow your Bernard Lewis reference, it seems like the U.S. has chosen a kind of misguided sense of history to follow into the future in Iraq. And it's maybe befuddled by attempts to sort of rewrite other wars like Vietnam. Is there as an example, a historical model or a historical story, to use this gentleman's phrasing, that we could use to structure steps forward and steps out of or into Iraq and the Middle East?
Yes.
Relations with
Well, you know, I fear that the U.S. Experience in Iraq is going to be very much like that of the British in the 1920s. The British had a big, important empire. They were unchallenged at that time. But after World War I, the British public was tired of wars, and they had lost a lot of people, and they'd been impoverished in some ways. And when it became clear that keeping Iraq was just going to be endless trouble, and the British mainly kept it by bombing people. They innovated Bomber Harris, who later conducted the fire bombings in Germany during World War II, innovated this technique initially in the 1920s in Iraq. So Churchill himself wrote in the early 20s that we should give the Iraqis 12 months. We should give Faisal, whom the British had installed as the ruler, 12 months to show good faith of the new political class. And if they can't do it, we're spending £8 million a year on this, and we should just get out. And that's the Churchill that all of the neoconservatives keep telling us we should follow. So in this particular instance, they might be right.
It's a good quote. We'll have to draw on that. Yes, here, and then Bill Breer.
My name is Peter Connolly. I just had two related questions. First, what if you were advising President Bush, what course of action would you advise him to follow? And second,
Stop listening to Bernard Lewis.
Well, you know, secondly, what do you believe the consequences of that would be, positive and negative? I read your blog, and I'm never quite sure what exactly you want us to do.
Well, you know, this question of what we should do, people are always asking me that. It's a fair question. But I'll tell you a little quick anecdote that Muqtada Sadr, the fiery Shiite radical cleric, formed the Mahdi Army in the summer of 2003. And then by spring of 2004, it was engaged in brutal fighting with the Marines. And Muqtada went to Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who's very wise and old and calm, and said to Sistani, look here, you know, if you think it's the best thing, if you want me to, if you give me the order, I will dissolve the Mahdi Army. And Sistani said, well, you didn't ask me before you formed it. Why are you asking me now? This thing is just not going to end well. The American public's not going to put up with a long-term big occupation of Iraq. I expect most of the troops to be out sometime in the course of 2009. And the structures that have been put in place, as Nir Rosen rightly says, are very unstable and fragile and could easily fall apart in the aftermath. And I think, you know, during the period 1975 to 1989, you just didn't want a vacation in Beirut. And Iraq is going to be like that for a while. Ultimately, these things tend to subside. People find other ways of arranging themselves, and they stop fighting. Either they come back together or they don't. You get Yugoslavia breaking up into 6 or 7 countries, or you get Lebanon and they make a deal of some sort. I think if there's a lot of trouble in the region, the Saudis won't like that, and they have lots of money to spread around to try to get people to calm down. And it's possible that when we're not in charge, other people more wise in the ways of the region may take it in hand, the way the Saudis did in Lebanon in 1989. But on the other hand, things could go even worse. There could be a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, we have kicked off, I would say, at least a decade or two of severe instability in the Persian Gulf region, which is the major source of world hydrocarbons, and we have thereby deeply endangered our energy security and that of our allies.
Bill Breer.
Yeah, Bill Breer, retired from the Foreign Service. Just a couple of parallels. You drew the one between Napoleon and the current day, but somebody a couple of days ago drew parallels between the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. And
That was the president.
Reconstruction of Japan and Germany, which shows a total ignorance of history, because those countries both had constitutional governments before World War II. Having said that, what I'd really like to ask you, though, your opinion on that's okay too, but they're getting a lot of, then of course the responsibility is entirely that of the Iraqi government. They're not getting their act together, and that's, so we're doing the best we can, but they're not cooperating. But my question really is about Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That sort of popped up a few months ago. That now it's all Al-Qaeda's fault, and we got to fight them there, rather than in Afghanistan or the Atlantic Ocean or what have you. How important is Al-Qaeda in Iraq now?
Well, I don't know. Does anybody in Iraq have bin Laden's phone number? I mean, what is so-called Al-Qaeda in Iraq?
Mesopotamia, I'm sorry.
Well, Mesopotamia. The thing is, you know, this Al-Qaeda business is just spin. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before the U.S. went there. In fact, the U.S. government has released documents from the Ba'ath Security Police. And there's this wonderful document from, I think it was 2000 or so, in which the Iraqi secret police are putting out this all-points bulletin. They say a dangerous radical has entered Iraq. His name is Abu Musab Zarqawi. He seems to have links to the Saudi terrorist bin Laden. He's very dangerous. His group is very dangerous. Find him and arrest him if you can. They were alarmed about Al-Qaeda before the war. And this is the same secret police that Dick Cheney keeps telling us put Zarqawi up in a nice hospital room in Baghdad and ministered to his illnesses and so forth. There's no evidence for that. We have the document that they were afraid of him, which Mr. Cheney has kindly helped to release. So there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and there were a few Kurds who went off to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And now, I mean, there are lots of groups in Iraq, some of them foreign, some of them local, who appeal to Islamic fundamentalism who deploy terror, and some of whom would like people to be very afraid of them, and so they announce that they're Al-Qaeda. And it's like claiming to be the boogeyman. But there are apparently only 800 to 1,200 foreign fighters in Iraq. The insurgency is probably a good 60,000 men. So this is a tiny little group, and they're mostly used as cannon fodder. And then apparently all that General Petraeus had to do was actually talk to some tribal sheikhs in Al-Anbar to get them just to kill these guys. the Weekly Standard and so forth assures us that Al-Qaeda has been taking care of in Anbar. So I don't understand. All of this discourse is contradictory. That Dick Cheney says we have to stay in Iraq to fight Al-Qaeda at the same time as he's saying that all you have to do is talk to the tribal sheikhs and they'll kill Al-Qaeda for you. Well, which is it? And why would we have to stay there if they'll do it? And is there really an Al-Qaeda there to begin with?
And,
so, yeah.
And again, to quote Nir Rosen, who made a just good point, he says, imagine there was no Al-Qaeda or that it was dealt with. It doesn't do a thing to change the political dynamics, the instability, or to end the various sets of civil wars going on.
But it scares the hell out of the American people as the administration wants to use it.
This is propaganda.
Well, yeah,
we have been given the propaganda treatment, and it's just like Bonaparte convinced the French that he'd had these glorious victories in Syria and
Petraeus is going to
Egypt.
come back and declare himself emperor.
Well,
We already have one now.
Yes. Quickly here, yes.
Thank you. Frank Smythe. I wanted to ask a question with 20/20 hindsight. On your blog, as I understand it, you've expressed ambivalence about the 2003 invasion because of the tyranny of Saddam. So I wonder if you could address what the H.W. Bush administration should have done in '91 after the Gulf War when you had the uprisings. Number one. And number two, what should the second Bush administration, W, have done about Saddam, if anything? Because clearly you've been critical from the beginning of the way this was done, but it seems like maybe you were thinking something should have been done if it was possible. So I wonder if you could address that. And I realize that's 2020, but it seems
yes.
useful.
No, it's a perfectly legitimate question. My position was that the Genocide Convention gives the United Nations Security Council the right to remove a genocidal government. And people asked me, well, is Saddam's government genocidal? I said a case could be made. So, but the Genocide Convention says that the complaining government should go to the Security Council, should give the evidence that the government is genocidal, and that the Security Council should then vote to remove the offending government. And that's not what was done. So that was my position, was that that could be done. That would be legal. In the United Nations Charter, to which we were a treaty signatory, you're not allowed just to fall on another country. It has to attack you, or there has to be some Security Council mechanism for going against it. So in the period before the war, this was the debate people were having, was that are there any circumstances under which such a war would be legitimate? And this was my position, that if it were done this way, then it could be at least legal or legitimate. But there's a posting that's up there in February in which I said, you know, in Star Wars, when they're in that trash compactor, Princess Leia and Harrison Ford and the others, and it suddenly goes, and Harrison Ford says, I have a bad feeling about this. I said, I feel the same way about this building war with Iraq. I can show you the passage. So I didn't think it was going to go well. And I said, Cheney is underestimating Arab nationalism, and there are all kinds of reasons for which this is unlikely to go well. But if the issue were, are there circumstances under which it would be legal to do it, those were the circumstances.
91?
91, you know, I think the realists were just right. I mean, the idea that the United States can now go in and occupy a country and reshape it is just, it's a 19th century colonial idea. The United States has influence. It can shape things at the margins, but direct frontal occupation is just not something that's plausible in these times.
What about knocking out Saddam's helicopters during the Intifada? That's what I'm wondering.
Oh, knocking out the helicopters in the Intifada. Well, the issue is that George H.W. Bush went on the radio and called on the Shiites and the Iraqi public in general to rise up and overthrow Saddam, and they did. And the Ba'ath Party was overthrown in 16 of 18 provinces in spring of 1991, at which point the Ba'ath military deployed helicopter gunships against the civilian crowds in places like Basra and Najaf, also deployed tanks, and very brutally crushed this uprising. Analogy to Hungary in 1956 wouldn't be so strange. And the issue at the time was that the Iraqi military had signed as part of the end of the hostilities a pledge not to use fixed-wing aircraft, but were the helicopters allowed to be used, and should General Schwarzkopf had just shot them down, which certainly he could have done if he had wanted to. The Bush administration declined to intervene, allowed the revolt to be crushed. It was being led by the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq from Tehran. The Saudis and the Turks weren't very eager to see that government come to power. What I would say is I think that Bush made a mistake in going to the Iraqi public and calling for them to rise up if he wasn't going to support them. But I think the mistake was in making that call in the first place.
Very back.
My question is, what is your take on the possibility that after 9/11, instead of addressing the Al-Qaeda threat as a military problem, but should have been addressed as a criminal problem, such as getting after the mafia in this country last century? Would that have maybe worked?
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, the question is whether Al-Qaeda should have been addressed as a criminal problem rather than a military problem. And what I would say is that it was, and that's been the only success we've had. Over 600 Al-Qaeda operatives have been arrested in Pakistan. They have been arrested in conjunction with efforts of the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, the CIA, and the FBI. And they have been tracked down and taken off the streets with excellent police work. And this is the largest such victory that the U.S. has had. It's one that you never see noticed in the press or when people write about it. Actually, James Risen tells the story is we got Western Union to let them put a CIA guy behind the desk. So the Al-Qaeda people in Karachi would come to this Western Union to wire money to the West to carry out an operation. So they would say, well, we want to send such and such amount of money to this address, to this person in Hamburg or wherever it was, or in Washington, D.C. But they were actually dealing with a CIA operative who, and slowly, the people on the other side of that were busted, and this guy was busted. And Risen says that the thing the FBI couldn't figure out was that this went on for like a year. They kept coming to this office to order. They said, wouldn't they figure out like that their old friends were not around anymore or after they went to that office? But then eventually they figured it out. So I think that there have been real successes from police work. Al-Qaeda is analogous, at least, to a criminal organization and can be busted in the same ways. The one thing I would say about military response is you had to take care of those 40 terror training camps in Afghanistan. If you had left them there, they're like the swamps producing mosquitoes. They would just have coming out of there and getting us. So there are people who say it was wrong to go into Afghanistan, wrong to try to overthrow the Taliban. Unless you overthrew the Taliban, you couldn't get rid of the training camps. So I think that what was done up until Operation Anaconda in early 2002 by the Bush administration was generally brilliant. I mean, Tenet came up with this idea of using special ops guys to laser target Taliban targets. The government was overthrown. The Northern Alliance was put in. It was, I think, a really successful enterprise. And then there was a successful follow-up in Pakistan. But over time, this emphasis on military occupation, who thinks that it's a good idea to keep 20, 30,000 U.S. troops in Pushtun territory for the long term? What's the mission there? At what point are the Pashtuns going to wake up in the morning and say, oh, not so interested in Islam anymore, and we don't mind if they're from
I apologize. I'm going to go with one last question, and then because I'm going to give people an opportunity to get their book signed and whatnot. Yes, sir.
Oda Aberdeen, Professor Cole, can you tell us what's the status of the Christian minority in Iraq, the Turkomans, and the Yazidis who were massacred? Why is it that these minorities are not being protected by our troops?
Yeah. So the question is about the minorities in Iraq who have often been targets of bombings and assassinations, and why aren't they being protected? Well, first of all, nobody in Iraq is being protected. Abdulaziz Hakim, who's the leader of the major bloc in Parliament, has very nearly been blown up several times, and so there's no security for anybody. The Christians of Iraq are an old indigenous community, and among the older Christian communities in the region, many of them have been forced to flee to Syria and Lebanon. Ironically enough, are often targeted by the Salafi or more fanatical Muslim guerrillas as somehow tied to the West. I mean, this is not the Christians of Iraq's fault that the Americans happen to be largely Protestant. I mean, there's not really any connection between the two, and the Iraqi Christians as a community were there before Islam. So, I mean, there's a sense in which they can be icons of Iraqi nationalism, but they have been configured by these fanatics as somehow foreign tinged, and so attacks have been made on them, on churches and so forth. They also don't have really good relations with the Kurds, and there have been tensions there that have contributed to emigration. The Turkmen, social scientists think there are about 800,000 of them. They're evenly split, more or less, between Shiites and Sunnis. They had a kind of folk Islam that had become more formal, more tied to the clerics and so forth. And they're very unhappy that they're likely to end up being swept into living under a Kurdistan government. They're Turkmen. They have affinities with Turkey. So it's kind of a mirror image, you know. The Kurds in Turkey are not, some of them are not happy being under Turkish rule. The Turkmen in Iraq are not very happy about the prospect of being under Kurdistan rule. And this is a problem geopolitically that could explode. You know, if you ever had, God forbid, a massacre, a big massacre of Turkmen at the hands of Kurdistan fighters, the pressure on the Turkish government in Ankara from the Turkish public to intervene to save the Turkmen of northern Iraq would be enormous. So there's a whole other shoe waiting to fall up there in the north.
Juan, thank you very much. We welcome you back, and I encourage all of you to pick up Napoleon's Egypt. I know many of you have, and I want to give Juan an opportunity to sign some books out front. So don't rush the stage. I'm going to take him around out front, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again. Again, thank you very much.